Hi, I'm Sean Mooney, professor at the University of Washington and Chief Research Information Officer of UW-Medicine. Over the past 2 years, we have been creating an initiative in medical data science, and as part of that, we have created this seminar. Speakers will include world-leading scientists who will tell us about how data can impact human health and their healthcare. Please use the link below to register for our mailing list to hear about future events in this series. We hope you enjoy them.
And he attended Emory University School of Medicine. He did his residency in otolaryngology here at the UW in Seattle, and followed on to do his fellowship in neurotology at the University of Cincinnati. He also obtained a master's degree in biostatistics at the Columbia University. Dr. Golub is an author of more than 90 peer-reviewed research publications and has co-edited 4 books, including a bestseller among trainees. Dr. Golub has an NIH-funded research program investigating the brain effects of age-related hearing loss, and he has lectured internationally, and his research has been reported in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and he is a leading pioneer in minimally invasive endoscopic ear surgery. Clinically, he's interested in optimizing treatment of age-related hearing loss and endoscopic ear surgery. And so before I pass the time on to Justin, I'm going to ask everybody to hold their questions to the very end, and we can have some time for questions and discussion at the end of the talk. And with that, Dr. Golub, passing the time to you.
All right. Do you see the intro slide full screen?
We do.
Okay, great. Well, I'm excited to be here. Again, I'm Justin Golub, an associate professor of otolaryngology, which means ear, nose, and throat at Columbia, New York, and proud UW grad. Get started here, my disclosures. So I just had to put a few slides of my lovely time at the University of Washington. I was there for 6 years. It was a 6-year residency program from 2007 to 2013 before Amazon took over South Lake Union and everything else. And this is me dead center in bright green on Crystal Mountain. And this is a picture of me at Harborview. I think this is at Harborview, toiling away, carrying multiple pagers and 2 phones. Probably they don't use pagers anymore. But most importantly, I've given maybe 40, 50 Zooms or Zoom talks or something over the last few years, and all of them have featured my lovely University of Washington wooden chair I got that I never got to brag about, but you all can see my beautiful University of Washington chair in the background that I'm very proud of. All right, so let's get started. A little bit more about me. This is kind of an interesting group. I assume there's very few, if any, otolaryngologists here, and I suspect the majority of people are not physicians. So I will try to make this sort of as understandable to non-clinicians and certainly non-otolaryngologists as possible. When you're a physician scientist, there's a spectrum from pure clinician to pure researcher, and I'm kind of right smack in the middle, which is, I think maybe some would say an unstable situation, but I've tried my best to stay 50%, 50%. This is me when I wear my clinical hat operating. My main clinical thing is endoscopic ear surgery, which I will not be talking about today. And in the other half of my academic life, I am an age-related hearing loss researcher. I investigate the brain effects of age-related hearing loss. This is my lab group here. This is a meeting recently in San Diego where I would prefer to have all my lab meetings. And this is a bar just down the street in Manhattan. So what I look at is the brain effects of untreated age-related hearing loss. On your left here is an audiogram, which is the way we measure hearing. And it is the typical pattern of age-related hearing loss. So let me put on my favorite tool here, the laser pointer. Can you all see my red laser pointer? I'll assume you can.
Yes, we can.
Thank you. In the low pitches here, the bass sounds, the hearing is good, and the high pitches, the treble, the hearing is bad. And this is typically what we see with age-related hearing loss. And the questions we ask are whether age-related hearing loss can cause bad things like cognitive decline, social isolation, and depression. So here's an outline of my talk, 4 sections over the next 45 minutes or so. So I'll try to conclude by 5 p.m. 5 p.m. Eastern time, sorry, not 5 p.m. West Coast time, 2 p.m. West Coast time. So we'll start out with some introduction on age-related hearing loss. Then we'll talk about some of the evidence showing the relationship between hearing loss and cognition, cognitive decline, and then some data on the potential effects of what I term subclinical hearing loss, which is what I'm most interested in. And then finally, some recent developments, including practical developments and next steps. All right, so let's begin with the intro on age-related hearing loss. What is age-related hearing loss? It is a phenomenon due to the death of inner ear hair cells. So within your ear, there's three parts: the outer ear, the middle ear, and the inner ear. Within the inner ear, you have these cells called hair cells that end in these hair-like extensions. And as you get older, the hair cells die. And the cause of this is unknown, and it is irreversible. And we treat it today with devices like hearing aids, and if your hearing loss is bad enough, then cochlear implants. But the big issue is that very few people actually treat hearing loss today, just a fraction. This graph here shows the prevalence of age-related hearing loss with decile of life going from the teens all the way up to 80 years and older. And on the y-axis is prevalence going from all people to no people. And you can see that as people get older, the prevalence of age-related hearing loss greatly increases to the point where over 80% of people over 80 have it. So it's one of the most common conditions of humans. This graph here shows hearing level over the lifespan. So same information I just showed, just presented in a different way. On the y-axis here is amount of hearing. We call it the hearing threshold, going from 0, which is perfect hearing, down to 50 or so, 50 to 70, which is kind of bad hearing. And on the x-axis now is every 5 years of life. And you can see that as people get older, on average, the level of hearing goes down and down. And this red horizontal line demarcates what we typically categorize as normal versus hearing loss, 25 decibels. So right around age 70 or can't read my own graph, around 70-ish, about half of people will have hearing loss, little younger than that. These data come from the NHANES. I'm not sure if people in the audience are familiar with NHANES. It's a national cross-sectional study that is done through the CDC, and the data in NHANES is supposed to be representative of the US population, and they use a complex survey design, so that's supposed to represent people in general, not those, for example, who've conveniently come into a doctor's office. And NHANES, they only go up to age 80, and then everyone after 80, they lump into an 80+ group. Because there aren't that many people out there who are 80+ potentially, so it could wreck the anonymity if they show you the true age over 80. And so when I was a junior attending here at Columbia, I found out that you can get access to the true age of people in NHANES if you drive to a US Census Bureau data center. And there was one at Yale, which is not that close. It's like an hour+ drive. And so being a junior attending, I had plenty of time on my hands. So I drove 4 or 5 times to Yale University, where I was monitored with a security camera and a live proctor, and my keystrokes were recorded, and they patted me down before I left the room to make sure I wasn't stealing US government data. And because of that, I can show you the purple box, which is the true prevalence of hearing loss in people who are 80+. Thanks to that, thanks to those trips to New Haven. And as it turns out, as you get even older, your hearing continues to decline. Thank you very much. So in summary, hearing loss is very common. Over 80% of people who are over 80 have age-related hearing loss, but yet the treatment of age-related hearing loss is very uncommon. Under a quarter of people who are over 80 actually do anything about it. And this disparity is, I would say, interesting. To put this in perspective, I'll give a clinical scenario. If you are an internal medicine doctor, maybe we have some in the audience, you might encounter a patient who has this lab value of glucose of 280. And often these patients are asymptomatic when they come in. And so if the doctor saw this value, they would assess for diabetes, and this is likely consistent with diabetes. And then they would say, you need to use insulin. And the patient may say, oh, I don't want to because I have no symptoms. If that happened, the doctor wouldn't just let the patient go. They would say, no, you really need to treat your diabetes, because if you don't, all these terrible things are going to happen. You will have vision loss, you'll have kidney disease, strokes, heart attacks, neuropathy, cognitive impairment. And when that patient saw another doctor, that other doctor would probably say the same thing, because we know from decades of longitudinal research that diabetes causes all these terrible things. Now, switching gears, if you were an otolaryngologist, an ear, nose, and throat physician, or an audiologist who saw a patient with this finding, which is the audiogram of someone with age-related hearing loss, you'd likely say you should treat this with a hearing aid. And then much like the diabetes patient, the patient would probably say, oh, I'm asymptomatic, I don't want to do anything. And if that happened, the doctor would probably say once or twice more, you should consider hearing aids. But what happens 9 out of 10 times is the patient says, oh, I'm not going to do anything. I don't want to. I don't even notice I have hearing loss. I was only dragged here by my spouse. And then they would leave, and then no one would ever really recommend that they wear hearing aids again. Why the different strength and recommendation between the subject who has the patient who has diabetes getting treatment versus the patient with age-related hearing loss getting treatment? The difference is we don't really know what this causes. There hasn't been a lot of research into what actually this causes in terms of the downstream consequences. And that's what my talk today is about. When we talk about causation, we talk about exposures and disease. This is sort of the field of epidemiology. And so exposure is simply the first thing in a causal chain. The disease or outcome is the second thing in the causal chain. For most of hearing loss research, we've considered hearing loss as the disease. So if you look at any otolaryngology journal related to clinical hearing loss research, before 10 years ago, all the papers looked at risk factors for hearing loss, like genetics, poisons to the inner ear, known as ototoxins, noise. We really focused on these exposures because if we can reduce these exposures, you could reduce the worst thing to an ear specialist, hearing loss. So we do something about what's in red and we can affect what's in blue. But what I look at is the reverse relationship. Now we treat hearing loss as the exposure, and I think that lets us ask more interesting questions. Rather than what causes hearing loss, we look at what does hearing loss cause? Does it cause depression? Does it cause cognitive impairment? Does it cause dementia? And while us in our golden silo, we really care about hearing loss, the rest of the planet cares about these bigger ticket items: depression, cognitive impairment, and dementia. Oh, I have a new one with Joe Biden here. This slide is from an older version of the talk. I'm sorry about that. It's supposed to be Biden. So when we talk about exposures and outcomes, we have to know the difference between association and causation. If you take away one thing from this talk, know that association does not equal causation. Causation is actually very hard to prove. How would we prove, for example, that hearing loss causes dementia? How would we do that? What we would really have to do is we could conduct an experiment. So we would take, there's how many people here? There's 27 people here. So we would take like 16 of you, or I'm sorry, I can't do math. We would take 14 of you and we would randomize you to be deafened. And we would take 13 of you and we would randomize you to not be deafened. And then we would wait. Oh, good, someone else entered. So now it's an even 14 in each group. So 14 of you be deafened, 14 of you would not be deafened. Then we would convene the Zoom again in 10 years. And the people who I deafened, we see if you tend to get dementia or cognitive impairment more rapidly. Of course, this can't be done in humans because it's unethical. So we could do the next best thing, which is a randomized controlled trial involving a treatment intervention. And in that case, we would take a room full of people with hearing loss. We would treat half, we would not treat half. We would wait a year or two, and we'd see if those who got treatment, if they tended to avoid cognitive impairment and dementia symptoms. This should be done, and it actually is being done, as I'll talk about in the last section of my talk, but most of the data today does not include RCTs. So what we have is the next best thing, which is where we get into sort of the data science world, because the data gets messy and you need statistics. We do longitudinal and cross-sectional studies. So then what we do is we take groups of people who have hearing loss and don't have hearing loss, and we see whether those who tend to have hearing loss tend to get the bad outcome more. They tend to get dementia more, for example. And this is the level of data that we have today. So just a few more review slides, and then we'll jump into the actual data. How might hearing loss, say, be related to dementia? Hearing loss is the exposure, which is in red. Dementia is the outcome or disease, which is in blue. So one possibility is a causal relationship from left to right, meaning hearing loss causes dementia. If you do studies and show that hearing loss and dementia happen together, you don't know whether hearing loss is causing dementia or whether the other direction is happening, whether dementia is causing hearing loss. All you know is they happen together, and that's what we call an association. Two things happen together, but you don't know what causes what. There's also the possibility that hearing loss and dementia happen together because something else causes both. And in fact, that to at least a partial degree, this is what happens in reality. People who have age-related hearing loss definitely tend to have dementia more because they're both old. So age is what we call a confounder. Confounders are third variables. It's called a third variable because 1, 2, 3, a third variable that causes both the exposure and the outcome. So when we do statistical analyses, we need to control for confounders because they screw up our hypotheses, hypothesized associations. If there's a strong confounding, then there's not really a true independent relationship between hearing loss and exposure. So we use this term adjusting in statistics, and I know some of this may be a review for some faculty in the audience, but I just wanted to do some intro slides. We use the term adjusting when we do statistical analyses like regression to reduce this possibility of confounding. That is my statistics and epidemiology crash course in 2 minutes. Now we'll do an audiology crash course in 1 slide. So how do we measure hearing loss? We measure it commonly with a unit called a decibel. A decibel is how loud needs to be in order to hear it, or a tone. And it goes for clinical purposes from about 0 to 100 decibels. Recently, I was at a meeting and an audiologist scolded me because there are actually many kinds of decibels. So you're really supposed to say which. So if there are any audiologists in the audience, what I mean is decibel, HL, or hearing level, dBHL. So 0 is great, 100 is bad. And then we chop it up into categories. 0 to 25 is normal, 25 to 40 is mild, 40 to 70 is moderate, 70 to 100 is severe to profound. And when we do clinical research, we need a good variable to encode or operationalize hearing loss. And so we use this thing called the pure tone average. So the hearing variable in all our studies is typically the pure tone average. It is a single number that represents your hearing, and it's how loud a tone has to be in order to hear it, averaged across several pitches, typically 4 pitches. And we usually just look in the better ear for simplicity's sake. So if you have a pure tone average of 25, that means in your better ear, you heard sound has to be 25 decibels loud in order to hear it, which means you have borderline normal hearing. If you have a pure tone average of 70, that means you have really severe hearing loss and you need to see your friendly UW cochlear implant surgeons. I think we're taking questions at the end. So I'll just launch into the next section, the relationship between hearing loss and cognition. So this field really took off about a decade and change ago. I'm just going to show you one paper, because we want to get to other newer, cooler things even. So Franklin, one of my colleagues who works at Johns Hopkins, I actually just saw him this weekend, he published this study in 2011 that looked at the relationship between hearing loss and dementia. So the exposure was pure tone average, aka hearing, measured by audiometry. And the outcome was incident dementia. Incident just meaning new cases of dementia over time. And he used this cohort study called the Baltimore Longitudinal Study of Aging. To this point, there wasn't really a lot of high quality epidemiologic or population level data about the relationship between truly measured hearing loss, in other words, with a high quality hearing measure like audiometry, and cognition and dementia. There have been some sort of clinical studies and convenience samples in clinics. There have been studies that use a terrible measure of hearing loss, like a question, yes, no, do you feel like you have hearing loss? That's a terrible way to have a hearing variable. So this is one of the first studies that had a high quality hearing measure. There were about 600 people in this study, and they were followed for about 12 years. So in 2011, that was like the end of the 12 years the study had been running. And they adjusted for potential confounders. These are things that could cause hearing loss and dementia. So for example, age, demographics, and cardiovascular risk factors. Cardiovascular stuff we care about because microstrokes could cause hearing loss, and little microstrokes could also cause dementia. And this is what they said. This is what they found. I'm gonna say it, and then for those who aren't epidemiologists, I will translate it to English. They found a hazard ratio of 1.27 per 10 dB worsening in the hearing level, which was significant. So in English, what this means is for every 10 decibels your hearing got worse, and remember I showed you a scale of hearing loss from 0 to 100 to give you an idea of how bad a 10 dB increment is. So for every 10 decibels worse your hearing got, the hazard or sort of like risk of getting demented over that decade of the study went up about 1.27 times. And we can graph that over amount of hearing loss. So again, this is per 10 decibels of hearing loss. So if we plot on the x-axis the amount of hearing loss you have, we see this dose-dependent curve. So here on the x-axis is hearing loss from 0, which is no hearing loss, to 100, which is deaf. And on the y-axis is the hazard or sort of like risk of getting demented over the decade. And you can clearly see that as the level of hearing loss went up, the hazard of dementia, of incident dementia, went up to the point where people who had severe hearing loss, which is like 70 decibels, they were over 5 times more likely to get demented over the study period than people with normal hearing, adjusting for confounders. And this was sort of a very sensational finding, and I would argue this paper kind of created an entire field, which is sort of the epidemiology or consequences of untreated age-related hearing loss. This was all over the news, and then there have been scores of papers since. In 2020, The Lancet, which is the most, I believe, the most cited medical journal in the world, came out with its second version of this report. The first was in 2017. That looked at the major risk factors for dementia, things you read about in the news all the time, like education, smoking, stuff, mind activities, what is a risk factor for dementia? And in both of these Lancet commissions, they concluded that hearing loss was the #1, the biggest risk factor for dementia, partly because of its great prevalence. They estimated that if you could completely eliminate hearing loss as a risk factor, you could potentially reduce dementia prevalence by 8%, which is pretty big. Okay. So I've just suggested that maybe age-related hearing loss causes dementia. I said maybe because we don't have RCT level evidence. So in terms of mechanisms, how could age-related hearing loss actually do that? So here, this slide basically explains the possible mechanisms. So first, there's the non-causal pathways, aka the confounders. So confounders like microvascular disease could cause both hearing loss and dementia. So little microstrokes, as I mentioned, could infarct the cochlea, the hearing organ, and cause hearing loss over age. And it could also cause multi-infarct dementia, which is the second most common cause of dementia or vascular dementia. It also may make Alzheimer's dementia worse. Age, whatever age is, whether it's free radicals or telomeres or whatever, that phenomenon could cause age-related hearing loss, could cause dementia. And most key, there could be unknown processes that we don't even know about that cause both. This is the most important confounder or set of confounders because it's the ones we can't control for. If we don't know about a confounder, we can't control it in our regressions. And so that's why regressions are not the be-all and end-all, and you really need randomized controlled trials to get a causation because you can't control for what you don't know about. Then there are the possible causal pathways. So there are 3 of these. One is reduced socialization. So people who have hearing loss, they on average likely socialize less. They probably would be less likely to come out to stimulating lectures by Columbia professors, and multiplied over decades, you could see how this may not be as good for their cognition compared to peers who do go and do these sorts of things. The second causal pathway is change in brain structure. There have been studies showing that people with age-related hearing loss, their temporal lobes will shrink a little quicker with age. The cochlea outputs to the brainstem, which then outputs to the temporal lobe. That's where the auditory cortex is located. And so if the auditory cortex and the temporal lobe isn't getting all that sound information to it over a period of time, it will atrophy. And the temporal lobe doesn't live in isolation. That could potentially have downstream effects. So change in brain structure could lead to potentially cognitive impairment, dementia. And then the third causal pathway is what we call the cognitive load pathway. What this says is that people with age-related hearing loss, they can often make out the words that are being said if they try really, really hard. The problem is that you only have sort of finite brain power. And so if you're using all your brain power to decode the words, you don't have any of your cognitive resources left over to do the more important high-level tasks like decoding the meaning of what was said or making memories. So for example, if you have hearing loss, and I'm talking about a story of me going into my attic and finding a bat, you may not know whether I said bat or rat or cat. So then you have to think about the context. You could say, well, he's in an attic. You wouldn't have a rat in an attic. You'd have a rat in a basement. What would be in an attic? It would be a bat, the flying animal. So he must have said bat, or maybe he was talking about a baseball bat, but it was something that was moving around. So it must be a bat, the animal. Okay, bat. By the time you realize correctly that I said bat, I'm now 3 sentences beyond, and you don't know what the hell the purpose was of what I was talking about. And over decades, if compared to a colleague, you didn't always get the meaning of what was said in all conversations you had, you could see how that may not be good for maintaining your cognition. All right. So I will now move on to chapter 3, which is subclinical hearing loss. So, and this is my own research here. This is what I'm interested in. So we've been talking about hearing loss as a risk factor for bad things that happen in older age, particularly cognitive impairment and dementia. But what is hearing loss? How do we define hearing loss? Typically, it's defined as a pure tone average of about 25 or over, but this is fairly arbitrary. If you look at old papers, there's not really a consensus on why this was chosen. It seems, if anything, very arbitrary. So a lot of studies just sort of binarize hearing loss at 25 and look at whether those with hearing worse than 25 tend to have, for example, more dementia than those better than 25. But like, do we have to look only at that cut point? And so we asked the question of whether associations with cognitive impairment, if they can begin with minimal levels of hearing loss. So what we did is we did a study of people only with good hearing of a pure tone average under 25. And we wanted to see if getting worse hearing within that range of normal, if that still shows a relationship with worse cognition. Okay, so this is a study of hearing loss among people who have basically no hearing loss, if that makes sense. So I made up this term subclinical hearing loss to kind of describe that. So the way we did this was with this national cohort study called the Hispanic Community Health Study that's run out of UNC. It's multi-centered. It's actually longitudinal, but we only looked at the first wave when we did this, which was 2018 to 2011. And we looked at people who were over 50, and there were about 5,000 people. For a part of this, we looked at this other big US study called NHANES, which I briefly mentioned, which is also cross-sectional. I mean, for purposes of my talk, it's kind of similar to Hispanic Community Health Study. They both are big, they both have audograms, they both have cognitive data. NHANES is representative of the US population, and the HHS is only Hispanics as the name would suggest. But we use them to get basically bigger ends. And most importantly, as I've already said twice, everyone in this study had, quote, normal hearing. All right, so this is what we did. We looked at the relationship between the exposure, which was hearing, as measured by the pure tone average, and cognition, as measured by a bunch of neurocognitive tests. Perhaps we have some neurologists or neuropsychologists on the Zoom. If not, just take my word for it that these are some common cognitive tests. And then we did multivariable linear regression to look at the relationship between hearing and cognition, controlling for potential confounders, things that could cause the exposure and the outcome. Things like demographics, which includes age, cardiovascular disease. We also controlled for hearing aids, which is the treatment for the exposure. You don't want to be studying people who get the exposure treated, because then you're attenuating the effect of the exposure if you don't have the exposure. So we controlled for that. So here are the results, looking just at that HHS data set. Again, people with PT's pure tone average or hearing, people with hearing level under 25 decibels. The mean age was 58. So these were sort of middle age or early old age people, middle age with a range of 50 to 75. The mean hearing level was good. Everyone, again, as I've beaten to death, this point has had had good hearing. And this is what we found. Among these people with what I call subclinical hearing loss, aka normalish hearing, for every 10 decibels worse their hearing got within that range of normal hearing, we found associations between that worse hearing and every single outcome. So unless, again, you're a neuropsychologist, you don't know what these numbers mean, but they were all significant. So as hearing got worse, the score on these cognitive tests went down. In other words, they did worse on the cognitive tests. And this was super significant, partly because there were like 5,000 people in the study, so we have tiny p-values. So if you're a good data scientist or a good researcher, you should ask a question at this point. I show this super low p-value, but anyone can get a low p-value if you have enough subjects. If you have enough subjects, everything is significant and everything has a low p. What you really want to look at is what we call the effect size. In other words, the difference between two groups, or like in this case, how much did the cognitive test score drop with the change in hearing? That's really what's important, the magnitude of the effect. So I will now attempt to visually explain that I think these results were clinically significant in addition to statistically significant, because clinical significance is many, many, many times more important. So this horizontal bar here shows the range of possible scores on the digit symbol substitution test in the HHS cohort. And the worst you could do is a 0, and the best you could do is 80. Okay, but no one ever gets a 0. No one ever gets an 80, right? It's like impossible because it's on a bell curve. So maybe there's like one person on the planet who got a 0, and that person had already deceased. And one person was a super genius and got an 80. So 95% of people got within 2 standard deviations of the mean by definition. That's what 2 standard deviations is. It's 95%. And that corresponds to a score between 20 and 46. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to stretch this out. So now this bar graph, or whatever line here, shows the score range from 20 to 46, representing what almost everybody gets. As bad as a 20, as good as a 46. Okay. The mean score is 33. So now I want to show you visually how much the score would change on average with certain levels of hearing loss. If you had 10 dB worse hearing, on average, your digit symbol substitution test score would drop about 2 points, controlling for these confounders. Now, visually, you can see this might make a dent. Okay, and this is actually just a 10 dB decrease in your hearing, which is not that much. My hearing is 10 dB worse than when I was at the University of Washington, because I had a hearing test when I was an intern by our audiologist, and I just had a hearing test recently. My hearing went down 10 dB, and I can't even tell the difference. A 25 dB decrease is a little more clinically relevant because that's a 1 category drop. In other words, going from mild to moderate hearing loss, moderate to moderately severe. So if you dropped a category of your hearing, say from mild to moderate, or really relevant to this sample, from perfect hearing, which is 0, to 25 decibels, which is borderline hearing loss, your score would drop visually this much, or 5 points. If I told you we were going to make your hearing go from perfect to borderline, and that might cause a decline in this cognitive test by visually this much on the range of scores of what 95% of the population can get, I'm pretty sure you would freak out and not want that, because that might impact your intelligence and livelihood. And now let's plot that across all of the cognitive tests. And this is visually what happened for a 25 dB decline in hearing. I'm trying to argue that visually, even if you're not a neuropsychologist, you can see that this was clinically meaningful. These are pretty big chunks of the intelligence that was taken out related to this decline in hearing. Okay, I hope that makes sense. It took a long time for me to make these slides to communicate what I think is a simple finding. So now I'm going to show these data I'm going to show another side of the data. Okay, now I'm going to show you the regressions. What I just showed you here, this was from just the Hispanic Community Health Study. Now I'm going to show you just the digit symbol substitution test, which was in 2 studies, the HHS and the NHANES. We get bigger numbers here, so we could do more interesting things. So this somewhat weird graph here shows the hearing on the x-axis going from good, -20, to bad, which is 100. And then the y-axis is the score on this cognitive test, the digit symbol substitution test, okay, where high is good and low is bad. And then I broke the x-axis up into two buckets: normal hearing, aka subclinical hearing loss, which is under 25, and frank outright hearing loss, which is over 25. So a couple things. First, the line of best fits, they're the multivariable regression. So this is the slope after you adjust for confounders. The first thing you see is over the entire range of hearing. As hearing gets worse, in general, the digit symbol substitution test score gets worse, right? This agrees with what I just told you. As your hearing gets worse, your cognition goes down. As hearing gets worse, your cognition goes down. If we break it up into two separate regressions, one regression for those with quote unquote normal hearing and those with quote unquote hearing loss, we see two things. First, the slope is still negative among those with normal hearing. So as your hearing goes from like 7-year-old perfect to borderline good hearing when you're like 40 or 50, there's still a negative slope showing that your decline in hearing from perfect to borderline kind of like made a difference. Those with worse hearing within the normal category still had worse cognition, even though they still had normal hearing. We see that, of course, in those with outright hearing loss. The second finding is that the slope is actually greater in those with normal hearing, which was not what I thought was going to happen. This is like a contrary to my hypothesis. So that means the relationship between declining hearing and worse cognition is actually stronger among those with subclinical hearing loss than it is with those with outright hearing loss. This is pretty weird. So then I said, let's do this sensitivity analysis and we'll define hearing loss more strictly. We'll define it as a hearing loss under, I'm sorry, let me say it again. We will, not more strictly, we will lower the cut point of hearing loss. So it's defined as greater than 15. And I thought, surely then we won't see any significant relationships between worse hearing and cognition if we only look at those with super duper good hearing. But that's not what we found. If we define hearing loss in a very rigid, strict way of 15 and under, we still saw a relationship. In fact, the slope was even steeper, which is just weird. It's like as soon as you have any decline in your hearing, that might potentially have an impact on your cognition. And the relationship actually is like bigger among those with normal hearing than those with hearing loss. It's like the biggest hit you take in your cognition, if you want to think about it in a causal way. It's like what happens right off the gate, which is kind of nuts. We then substantiated these findings in two additional papers that looked longitudinally in something called the Health ABC study and the Baltimore Longitudinal Study Aging Study. I don't have time to show these, but we have like a total of 4 papers all showing the same result. Then we did the same thing looking at depression as the outcome. So now I'm going to show you a study that was the same damn study, same methods, only instead of looking at dementia, we looked at depression. So same exposure, hearing, different outcome, depression. And we measured it with this depression inventory. Same method of linear regression, same confounders we adjusted for. Now this is the same kind of like regression I showed. The only difference is the y-axis sort of like directionality is flipped. So with this measure of CSG10, now bad is high instead of bad being low. So now bad depression is high, little depression is low. The x-axis is the same, going from normal hearing to a lot of hearing loss. So if we draw a line through all the points and adjust for confounders, we see that as hearing gets worse, people tend to get more depressed, controlling for confounders. Other papers have shown this. This is like already known that hearing loss is related to depression, controlling for confounders. And this is what we reproduced here. So I did this thing called the GAM regression. For those of you who use R, it's very easy to do this thing called the GAM regression. It stands for, if I remember correctly, generalized additive modeling. It basically just draws a curve through a cloud of points. You don't really get a numeric summary. It's just a visual way to look at the data. It gives you just a visual plot, unlike a regression, which gives you like a slope in numbers you could put into a formula. So in this GAM regression, you can kind of see that the slope looks steeper in the normal hearing group and it looks shallower in the hearing loss group. Ignore the tail here because there's only like 2 people who are deaf. So the confidence interval is massive. So forget about the tail going down. That's kind of weird. The point is the slope seems to taper out in this group of people who have outright hearing loss. Then if we do the broken stick regression, as we call it, and break up into 2 regressions, we see the same phenomenon again. Those with normal hearing still have a relationship between depression. In other words, those who have worse hearing within the category of normal hearing have more depression for every bit of hearing loss that happens. And same thing with hearing loss. And if we draw the actual regressions, we see the same thing we just saw before, that the slope is actually steeper in those with normal hearing, which is kind of weird. And then we can express that in numbers. I'll just skip those in the interest of time. The point is bigger number, meaning bigger slope in the normal hearing group. We do the same thing now, making the cut point 15 decibels. So we now define hearing loss in a different way, super strict. And again, for every little bit of hearing decline, there's more depression, even among those with super good hearing, which is surprising. And here are some numbers. So in conclusion, in this set of studies, we found that worse hearing was associated with lower cognition and depressive symptoms among adults with subclinical hearing loss, i.e. minimal levels of hearing loss, defined audiometrically like this. And so the sort of like take-home conclusion is that the relationship between hearing loss and worse neurocognitive states, worse cognition, worse depression, it may begin earlier than previously realized. It may already happen when your hearing is still so-called normal. And maybe we define hearing loss in a too lax way. Maybe this 25 decibel cutoff is too lax and we need to be stricter and move the cutoff down to 20. And actually, since these papers were published, the World Health Organization actually had moved down the cut point to 20. I don't think it's necessarily because of my papers, but there's been a movement in this direction, which is kind of cool. So more take-home points. What does this mean from a clinical standpoint? I think it means that every drop of hearing may matter. Instead of thinking of hearing loss as a disease, it's sort of just a continuum of hearing. The more hearing you have, the better for your biological fitness, perhaps. Maybe we should treat hearing loss earlier. We do a terrible job of treating hearing loss in this country. People typically don't get hearing aids. They should probably get them and probably get them earlier. But how early do we treat it? I just showed you data showing that people with like 17 decibels of hearing have, on average, slightly worse cognition than those with 2 decibels hearing level. We're not going to stick hearing aids on people with normal hearing. That makes no sense. So how do we actually treat that? And the answer may be better environments, better acoustics, better sound environments. So in a learning environment, everyone can hear whether their hearing is 2 decibels or 17 decibels and so forth. This work actually made a splash. I got my 15 minutes of fame. The UW Department of Otolaryngology was like super duper proud of me to make up for my residency performance. And now let's conclude with recent developments and next steps. So one very cool thing that has happened recently from the broader field showing that hearing loss may actually be bad for you and not just a humorous nuisance of late life is over-the-counter hearing aids. So if hearing loss is bad and people do a terrible job, or rather the system does a terrible job at treating hearing loss, one thing we could do is make hearing aids, the treatments, cheaper and more available. And that's exactly what happened after 8+ years of effort, starting in October 2022 with over-the-counter hearing aids. Now you can go to Best Buy and buy Bose branded over-the-counter hearing aids for $850, which is a hell of a lot cheaper than prescription hearing aids, which are like $5 grand. You can get them at Walgreens and so forth. I like this slide because it illustrates something incredibly simple that you think people would get, but they definitely don't get. Because every week I have 1 or 2 patients who comes into my clinical office and says, "Doc, I'd like you to write me a prescription for those new over-the-counter hearing aids." So for any people who don't quite get this, let me break it down for you. Here is a grid with over-the-counter on the top, prescription on the bottom. In drugs, we have 2 kinds. Over-the-counter drugs like Claritin or Allegra or Zyrtec or Afrin, and we have prescription drugs. One you could walk into a pharmacy and buy without a doctor. One you need a prescription from a doctor. In the hearing world, now we have 2 categories of hearing aids. Over-the-counter hearing aids, which you can walk into any drugstore and just buy and walk right out and program them yourself, or prescription hearing aids, which require an audiologist and in some states a physician as well to prescribe and fit. Okay, let's see, we got 8 minutes left. We're right on time. So how do over-the-counter hearing aids work? I know this is bringing me a little outside of the data science theme of today's talk, but in the questions, people always ask me these like clinical practical questions. So I put a few slides on over-the-counter hearing aids. Maybe there's some people here who are contemplating over-the-counter hearing aids. So you self-program them, you customize them with a smartphone, and they're tailored to your unique hearing loss. So they're not like just an amplifier, they're tuned to your audiogram. You just have to do the tuning yourself with your smartphone, as opposed to a real hearing aid, rather, not real hearing aid, I misspeak, a prescription hearing aid, which an audiologist would program for you. Who makes them? Many companies, including some you've heard of and some you may not have. And I think this market will expand in the future, and maybe even companies like Apple will enter it. You can get them anywhere, drugstores, online. I just showed you this. You can get them on Amazon. Here's a Sony hearing aid. You can get them CVS. This is cool. This is a public health campaign launched through my colleagues at Johns Hopkins to educate the consumer public about hearing loss. So if we were in person, I would poll the audience. Let me just do it anyway for rhetorical purposes, even though I know I won't see any hands. Pretend you're here with me in person. So raise your hand if you know what 20/20 means. And everyone's hands goes up. Everyone knows 20/20 is perfect vision. Raise your hand if you know what 25 decibels means. Well, I just told you like 20 slides ago, but if you hadn't heard that, nobody's hand would go up. And that's kind of bizarre. Everyone knows that 20/20, 20/40, 20/80 is how you measure vision. Nobody knows how we measure hearing. And that's, I don't know why. That's, regardless of how it happened, that's ridiculous. And so there's this big public health campaign called Hearing Number. I mean, go to hearingnumber.org, not OG, not original gangster, ORG, to help spread the word of how we measure hearing. Okay, so what's next? So I just showed you a bunch of epidemiologic studies, cross-sectional and longitudinal studies showing associations between hearing loss and cognitive impairment, hearing loss and dementia, controlling for confounders. But you can't prove causation with epidemiology. You can suggest causation. You really need randomized controlled trials to show causation. And so this is what we need now, and this is what's going to happen. So the biggest thing is this clinical trial out of Hopkins called Achieve, which has been running for the last 4 or 5 years, and it just ended. There are nearly 1,000 people. They're all 70 to 84 years old. And what they did is they randomized people to get a hearing aid, what they call a best practices hearing intervention, versus a placebo, which they call a successful aging intervention. And then they do a bajillion tests, the primary outcome being neurocognitive tests. And these data should be available soon. I think they said July or August, it's going to be announced at an Alzheimer's meeting in Europe. So you'll hear about this in the news, especially if the findings are positive. This will be in every newspaper. So this will be big. And then here at Columbia, we are just launching a smaller scale randomized controlled trial called EARLY, which stands for Early Age-Related Hearing Loss Investigation. Took me about 2 months to figure out this acronym. And this is like the baby cousin to the Achieve trial that I just showed. It is also an RCT randomizing people to get a hearing aid or not. The cardinal differences are that the participants are younger, which goes along with my interest in minimal levels of hearing loss, and they have better hearing. So this is an, excuse me, this is an RCT. Hopefully we'll start soon. It'll run for about 3 or 4 years. Each participant will be enrolled for a year, about 150 people total, and they're 55 to 75 years old, and we'll randomize them to get a hearing aid or a placebo. And we're going to look at 3 main outcomes: cognition, to see if those with hearing aid are a little mentally sharper after a year; socialization, we hypothesize that people will be more social if they can hear; and then we're going to look at functional and structural MRIs. This is a schematic of what I just told you. So participants have to have early age-related hearing loss and also a little bit of cognitive impairment, in part for power reasons. We want to have people who are at risk for dementia. So we want people who have a little bit of mild cognitive impairment. Then we're going to randomize them. And then we're going to look at these 3 outcomes: cognition, which is the distal outcome, and then 2 intermediate outcomes that are hypothesized to be on the causal pathway between hearing loss and cognitive decline. I'm going to skip this because you're all probably not necessarily clinical trialists and don't need to know about the nuances of my studies. Oh, we have some University of Washington collaborators, actually. Dr. Fine, who's in the Department of Psychology, is our fMRI expert. So hopefully I can get a free trip to Seattle, go to Cafe Ladro again. So that better still be open. If not, somebody tell me, because then I won't come to Seattle. So final points. Hearing loss is incredibly common. Over 80% of people over 80 have it, yet the treatment is very rare. Under 20% of people who are over 80 actually do anything about hearing loss. The effects of hearing loss, the hypothesized effects of hearing loss may begin earlier than previously recognized with what we term subclinical hearing loss, or a hearing number, AKA the pure tone average, under 25 decibels. If this is true, then what we need to do is work on improving access to hearing throughout the spectrum of hearing loss. So hearing aids, prescription hearing aids are a tool for people with a lot of hearing loss. Over-the-counter hearing aids are a tool for people with minimal levels of hearing loss. And then we need better acoustics for all us normal hearing people, just to try to be able to optimize the signal going to our brain. We need to think about acoustics and the sound environment. I mean, think about designing a lecture hall, right? A lot of effort go into acoustics. This is important. We could do that in places beyond just lecture halls. What about restaurants, which are like deliberately hard to hear in? What we need is more mechanistic evidence showing a relationship between hearing loss and cognition, and a treatment randomized controlled trial, which is actually being done now. So here's my final slide. Even if you hate data science, even if you think data science is a farce, is fake news, and all you read is what's on Facebook and Twitter, that's not substantiated with evidence, let me just give you an anecdote that will still prove my point that we do a crappy job at treating hearing loss in adults today. When a child has hearing loss, they are virtually always treated. It's pretty rare in this country that a parent brings a child in for hearing testing, find that they have hearing loss, and that parent chooses not to treat their child. No, they get hearing aids for the slightest amount of hearing loss. By the way, this is my daughter years ago. In adults, they will probably never treat their hearing loss, or if they do, it'll be decades after they already started having hearing loss. This is my grandfather on his 90th birthday, who happened to have a lot of hearing loss. What do you call it when you have two groups of people that have the same disease but are treated vastly differently? One gets treatment, one is neglected. What do you call that? Call that a disparity. And disparity in care is never right. It always is due to some underlying rip in the social fabric or the treatment fabric. And there's many reasons why this exists. People make excuses. Oh, people don't want to wear hearing aids when they're adults. They have agency, they can choose, and blah, 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 blah. Sure, that's great. But at the end of the day, we're not treating our older people, and we're doing a good job of treating our children. And we could do a much better job at treating our parents and grandparents. And I will end on that note. So thank you very much.